was my idea, but I stole the idea from my senior partner, esteemed colleague, and longtime, lifelong friend, Max Kampelman. Max was with the delegation, U.S. delegation, President Reagan at the Reykjavik conference, at which this issue of eliminating nuclear weapons was taken up in a serious fashion for the first time really since 1947, which was at the dawn of the Cold War, and also the dawn of the nuclear age, at which the United States proposed that nuclear weapons should be eliminated. Between that time and now, with the exception of Reykjavik, very little progress was made, except for the rounds of arms control negotiations held between the United States and the Soviet Union, which resulted in arms reductions, but not the prospect, really, of nuclear arms elimination or a world free of nuclear weapons. Max has sought to revive, and I think it's fair to say he's had a great deal of success in reviving the spirit of Reykjavik. And for that, I think we should all thank him. Max, you want to stand up? With President Obama's speech last year in Prague announcing that a world without nuclear weapons would be a priority of his administration, a high priority administration, the issue has taken on a new ascendancy and relevance that it hadn't had until now. So it's appropriate that we are here today to debate that question, whether this is a sound policy, a dangerous illusion, whether, and in particular, whether it's in the national security interests of the United States. Proposals to create a nuclear-free world obviously raise a host of questions, and we have two excellent debaters to debate this issue. Let me just introduce them and then tell you what the ground rules will be. Arguing in favor of the proposition that the United States should seek the elimination of nuclear weapons is Ambassador Thomas Pickering. Ambassador Pickering holds the personal rank of career ambassador, the highest in the United States Foreign Service. In his 4-decade career, he served as ambassador of the United States to the United Nations, the Russian Federation, India, Israel, El Salvador, Nigeria, and Jordan. That's the globe. He retired from the government in 2000 as U.S. Undersecretary of State for Political Affairs. Following his retirement, Ambassador Pickering became Senior Vice President for International Relations of the Boeing Company, where he served for 5.5 years, and he is now the Vice Chairman of Hills & Company, advising major U.S. enterprises. He's an active board member of public interest organizations, far too numerous to list, including the International Crisis Group, the American Academy of Diplomacy, which he chairs, and the United Nations Association, which he co-chairs. He's also a member, I think, of the Executive Committee, is it, Tom, of the Global Zero Movement? Yes. Taking the opposing position is Frank Gaffney. Mr. Gaffney's government service includes the position of Assistant Secretary of Defense for International Security Policy, the senior position in the Defense Department with responsibility for policies involving nuclear forces and arms control. Prior to taking up that position, he was the Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Nuclear Forces and Arms Control. Mr. Gaffney is the founder and president of the Center for National Security Policy and the host of Secure Freedom Radio, a nationally syndicated radio program. He is the lead author of War Footing, 10 Steps America Must Take to Prevail in the War for the Free World, which was published in 2005. We will proceed as follows. Tom, speaking for the proposition, will begin. He will have a total of 20 minutes. And Tom, do you want to reserve 5 for rebuttal? And inclusive of the 5 minutes for rebuttal. And Frank will follow, and he will also reserve 5 minutes for rebuttal. So Tom, would you begin?
Thank you, David, very much. I'm delighted to be here, and it's a pleasure to appear with Frank. My sense is that we have 2 specific questions to answer. Is a policy of eliminating nuclear weapons important to the security of the United States? And secondly, what might be some of the ways to go about this very difficult task? I think self-evidently the highest priority of the current government and one of the highest priorities of the past government has been to deal with the question of can terrorists acquire nuclear weapons, and if so, how and in what way do we prevent this? The calamity of the explosion of a nuclear weapon anywhere in the world is obviously something that would be of the highest security importance to the United States, whether we were directly involved or not. Were we to be directly involved, obviously, it would be in every significant way a major catastrophe for us and a very difficult problem. Moving toward zero, in my view, helps enormously. If we do not move toward zero, I think we continue to undertake three serious dangers, which make confidence in the present status quo illusory and indeed something of a chimera and a snare and a delusion. Those three questions are tightly interlinked and have to do, obviously, with the danger of our undergoing some kind of nuclear attack or the explosion of a nuclear weapon here or anywhere else in the world. The first of those is proliferation. We have, I think, been quite successful in dealing with proliferation, but it is not in that way a hermetically sealed box. And we all know that enormous hours and a great amount of time and attention, indeed national effort, has been spent both on proliferation in the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, which has already conducted 2 tests, happily at very low levels, and Iran, which continues to be a major problem for this administration, as was for the last, and one that we're deeply concerned about. Were it only those 2 countries, one might have a slightly relaxed feeling in the constant state of tension over this issue that all of us experienced during the Cold War. The real difficulty, of course, is that in every way, proliferation in one area leads inexorably to proliferation in other areas. And so in the Middle East, one does not have to be a serious expert to understand that Turkey, Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, perhaps Egypt, all in one way or another could be lined up to move in this direction. They have the financial capacity to do so, and some have the technical capacity, and indeed these are worrying, not because they are immediately going to do so, but because we have seen a chain of events that moves from one place to another as nuclear weapons are increasingly acquired. The second 2 factors are deeply related to the question of the acquisition of nuclear weapons by increasing numbers of powers, as well as by those who already have them. And these are the problems of accidents, and we have seen accidents in the past. Just last year or the year before, we fired the 2 most senior civil and military officials in our Air Force because nuclear weapons inadvertently were hung on an airplane and flown from the central United States to California. And the question of miscalculations. Miscalculations are not obviously always easily to be guarded against, but we saw in the aftermath of the Cuban Missile Crisis the revelation over a time that the Russians actually delegated weapons use authority, apparently, to some of their senior generals in place in Cuba. And one can only imagine what would have happened had, in fact, a miscalculation on their part on the site actually taken place at that time of high tension and difficulty. So we live still in an imperfect nuclear world, and the difficulties and dangers are that it is more likely to get worse than get better, even though many of us who have worked for years against proliferation can take some satisfaction that President Kennedy's original prediction about numbers did not hold true. We seem to be, once again, back in a surge of efforts to move in that direction. No particular formula, in my view, is a perfect answer to every problem. But indeed, the ability to move toward a world without nuclear weapons and achieve it would, I think, bring a great deal more stability and indeed a great deal more confidence. Such a move would, of course, have to be accompanied by efforts to continue to resolve political problems. People would like to see this as soon as possible. The realities are that the difficulties are enormous. No one could move to this particular position alone. We are not advocating, and I certainly would never support unilateral disarmament. It will be an enormous diplomatic, indeed an enormous technical task to convince others that they should move with us in this direction. What I am particularly happy about is that sitting in this room is a man who has devoted his life to these issues, and a few years ago decided that it was time for the rest of the world to take this issue out of the closet where it had comfortably rested as perhaps a chimera and a delusion, an unimplementable dream, and ask the rest of the world why we should not address this issue and do so seriously.
He is a remarkable human being. And Max, you were able in your own way to convince hard-nosed Cold War veterans like George Shultz, Henry Kissinger, Bill Perry, and Sam Nunn to take another look at this question, to take it out of the closet, and to begin to devote time and attention to the need to begin to take on this particular problem. To answer the question not whether we should go there, which I think is now answered, but whether and how, if we should go there, we can do so, dealing with the major problems that stand in the way, and moving ahead to try to make that happen. No one, of course, is totally convinced that this whole question will work. But surely no one is convinced in this room and elsewhere that we should not make the most serious kind of effort to see if we should get there. And what can be done and how it can work opens the door to many possibilities. It is true, as David has told us, that President Obama and President Medvedev, surprisingly to many, have themselves undertaken this goal as a serious objective of their countries, something that I would not have expected to see in my lifetime. They've acknowledged it's a long process. They believe it may take some more time, but it is important to take a look at it. How could we get there were we to find the way? Well, there are a number of barriers, and there are a number of difficulties, and there are a number of uncertainties. One thought is that on the basis of what technical evidence we now have accumulated in respect of past disarmament, we believe the number of warheads that have to be eliminated to get to zero could be eliminated in a decade or perhaps slightly more, given our present capacities and perhaps reconstructing some past capacities. Just within the last week, the United States has announced it has 5,113 operational warheads. The view is that it probably has another 4,000 in the process of dismantlement. Russia has a similar but somewhat larger figure with a judgment of a total of around 13,000. Inspection and verification will be a critical part of any effort to move to zero. We know a great deal about this. A lot of it has taken place already with respect to existing nuclear disarmament arrangements. The New START arrangement agreed to with the Russians has continued some of the basic principles that are important in an effective inspection mechanism. My own experience leads me to believe that this is a critical factor, that you will have to have access everywhere in order to do so, that moving to zero will make the inspection of the final state somewhat easier because any evidence of either fissile material for weapons purposes and/or weapons or weapons work themselves will be an absolute violation of the arrangement. That's important. National systems will have to back up international systems and vice versa, as we have seen in the process in the past. And it is important that we have a situation in which we also look at the difficult and very vexing issue of enforcement. Were there to be violations, one expert has suggested we should build into the agreement pauses which would allow for the clarification and the clearing up of a violation, or if that is not done, leave countries in no worse state than when they started the pause as a way, obviously, to go back to what is lamentable but necessary, the status quo ante, at least as a way of dealing with the problem in the absence of the kind of conviction that we would hope to instill in others to move this process ahead. There are other arrangements that would be very, very important. The U.S. and Russia will have to lead. They will have to take the major first steps to bring stockpiles, the size of which I've just mentioned, down to levels where others can be brought to join in. There's no question at all that all with nuclear weapons will have to be part of the effort. Some have produced plans that are interesting that call for proportionate reductions after the U.S. and the Russians come down over a series of stages leading to the final levels of zero. One idea is obviously, in addition to incorporating the rest stops or the pauses, to take a hard look at the question of enforcement. My own view is, having spent some time there, the Security Council is not a reliable organ to oversee the question of enforcement. We probably, in the connection with the treaty, would have to put together enough of an arrangement with a supermajority not subject to veto to deal with enforcement. This will be painful for the permanent 5 members of the Security Council who happen to be the preeminent nuclear powers. On the other hand, we cannot get there from here without convincing the permanent five members, the key nuclear powers, that this issue is in their long-term national security interest in avoiding accidental use, miscalculated use, or other use, perverse or otherwise, in the process. Conventional forces are a serious question. The Russians, indeed, I think, count their nuclear posture as their ace in the hole against Chinese conventional superiority. At the same time, conventional forces can play a role in the event of cheating, were countries to develop a small number of nuclear weapons. Conventional preponderance on the part of other states who were obviously committed to the regime would not be an irrelevant factor in dealing with the consequences of that kind of an activity. In the world of the blind, the one-eyed man is king is an enormously powerful aphorism, but we have to think about it in the context of hard realities. Hopefully a build-down in political tensions, hopefully important but obviously serious balanced conventional forces, and hopefully in the nature of other kinds of activities which we've been undertaking for a long period of time. While all nuclear weapons are not delivered by missiles, they may be perhaps both the most precise and the most rapid. Over a period of time, I would certainly favor a serious look at missile defenses to come in at a time when we were building down offensive armaments. We will have to be careful to guard against what would be a period of instability in that process when one side might feel through a combination of offensive size and defensive capabilities, it could achieve the kind of successful first strike moment. I think this is entirely possible. The Russians would be more worried about that, at least in terms of their professions of concern than others, but I think it can be dealt with effectively through careful thought and planning if we are able to convince others that this is the way to move, and I think it is significant that we should do so, and obviously would be important in the process that we intend to make to move things ahead. So let me conclude and say that no one knows whether we can get there, but I would hope that everybody is agreed that it is now time to make a very serious effort to look into the possibilities of doing so, and indeed on the basis of that kind of careful look, to make a conscious decision to continue to move in that direction. Step by step is difficult, but I think over a period of time it will be important. The recent New START agreement is a good step in that direction. We will need to address further the questions of ballistic missile development. Can it be achieved? Is there a cooperative effort to deal certainly with rogue states that's possible in this particular area? Can we continue to move down the ladder of the nuclear disarmament process? Does it make sense? Are the present levels of weapons those that we can live comfortably with, or should we begin to think about smaller is better and moving towards zero? These are all, in my view, advisable steps and important ones to take. It is fascinating that, in fact, over a period of time, our certified Cold War leader, and indeed the one to whom we devote the most attention with respect to the ending of the Cold War, Ronald Reagan, had himself this particular vision. He was not able, I think, in many ways, to carry it forward the way Max Kampelman and others have brought it forward, but nevertheless, it leaves one at least wondering why we haven't come to this sooner, and why indeed we haven't undertaken the efforts to move in this direction more rapidly. I leave that all for you to think about. It's been a pleasure to lay out these thoughts. I think we have a very, very interesting issue to discuss, and I look forward to hearing from Frank and obviously talking to you further about it.
Frank.
Well, good afternoon. Thank you very much for not only affording me an opportunity to try to address the question that Ambassador Pickering just posed of why we haven't done this sooner, but just actually to have the chance to debate this proposition. I am relatively junior to some of the eminences who have endorsed this idea. But I think what I would say is that never in my professional life, of now some 35 years, have I seen anything remotely as consequential to the national security of the United States as this proposition get as far as this proposition has gotten with as little debate. So I applaud the two sponsors for facilitating this debate. I hope it is one of many. I'm prepared to go on the road, Tom, if you'll come with me. And reserve judgment until you see how it goes. Anyway, I wanted just to say at the outset, in addition to thanking the sponsors, that I want to recognize particularly Tom Pickering's service to our country as a distinguished public servant over many years. And I can say that I understand the attraction that he and a number of others who, like him, have rendered considerable service for many years, feel to, rounding out at this stage of their lives, their careers, their public persona, if you will, with this association. It seemingly is, after all, the sort of thing that is not only so laudable from a moral point of view, but so indisputably desirable, to rid the world of nuclear weapons. Especially if you can throw in a Ronald Reagan affinity or affiliation, it really seems sort of like a slam dunk, doesn't it? Well, it falls to me to suggest that it isn't a slam dunk, that it shouldn't be seriously pursued, and that the reasons, I think, are commonsensical, not matters of high abstraction or policy, but just plain common sense. And I am going to try to lay them out in that kind of fashion, recognizing that this may sound as though I am speaking to a less sophisticated, less experienced audience than this, and I hope you'll forgive me for doing so, but I'm trying to speak to what I think are the practical considerations that argue powerfully against even espousing this idea, let alone pursuing it. Now, I think, as Tom Pickering has said, and others have, certainly the President of the United States has, by way of, I think, trying to make it clear that this is not the lunatic, radical notion that we have often sensed it to be, in light of real-world conditions. Because they're not talking about doing it right away. They're talking about this as a vision, something that we strive for some time to come. The President said for his lifetime, and he's a fairly young man. So what's that, 40 years perhaps? During which time we're often said we're going to have an effective, a credible, a safe nuclear deterrent. Because it will still be a world in which there will be nuclear weapons, and we don't want, as Tom has said, to be without them in that kind of environment. I'm afraid that the effect of even endorsing this proposal, let alone trying to carry it out, in some setting short of general and complete disarmament, as our friends the Soviets used to say, will unfortunately make it exceedingly problematic, if not, as a practical matter, impossible for the United States to maintain a safe and effective and credible nuclear deterrent. And I'll address several points in turn. First of all, is this in fact a desirable idea? Well, I think Tom has indicated that he believes that it should be pursued before there's general and complete disarmament, before we actually see the proverbial lion lying down with the lamb. What that suggests is that we could well find ourselves, were we to go in this direction. Let's set aside for the moment the achievability question. Let's just stipulate for the purposes of discussion that we actually could rid the world of nuclear weapons in an environment in which, as he's sort of euphemistically put it, there are still political tensions. Well, I suggest to you that history tells us that that's a world in which you will see conventional war, perhaps on the scale that we saw twice in the last century, that inflicted the greatest carnage mankind has ever known. I submit to you that's not the kind of world we want to live in. And I believe that nuclear weapons, to this point, have prevented that kind of recurrence. Do we really want to risk it? Do we really want to risk going back and seeing whether it'll be different this time? That the political tensions in a world in which there are conventional weapons, and maybe for the moment we have the preponderance of them, but maybe we won't in the future. Do we really want to risk, if you will, making the world safe for conventional war again? I think not. Is this proposition achievable? I think, like the Kellogg-Briand Pact of the 1920s, you could conceivably see people signing up to this treaty. Indeed, it is useful to note that not just elder statesmen, but I think all the world's great statesmen in 1928 thought the banning of war would be a salutary thing. I suspect that the predecessors to those of you in this room who are admirers of international law would have found considerable support for it. It didn't work out, folks. As I say, the second of those two horrific cataclysms resulted in some 60 million people losing their lives when it turned out war was not prohibited. So, could we get to zero this time? Could we get to a world in which we have effectively, not just on paper, but actually rid the world of nuclear weapons? Well, I'm troubled by the fact, notwithstanding what President Medvedev has perhaps whispered in the ear of our president, there is no evidence that any nuclear power, or for that matter, any of the dangerous wannabe nuclear powers, is actually prepared to exercise the kind of restraint we are exercising, let alone commit unambiguously, to say nothing of take steps to go towards the denuclearization of their country. That is certainly true of Russia. Russia is modernizing its nuclear forces, which indeed they do believe are a legitimate and necessary complement to their conventional power. Not just against the Chinese, by the way, but to threaten others, including our allies, notably the Poles and the Czechs most recently, or perhaps the Georgians and the Ukrainians. We cannot uninvent the technology of nuclear weapons. This is a nasty little but commonsensical consideration, folks. Especially in an environment where, under international legal arrangements, notably the treaty that is now being reviewed in New York, we tell ourselves, committed to give nuclear weapons technology, nuclear weapons relevant technology to any country that forswears a nuclear weapons program. And I'm joined by two distinguished ambassadors who I think can attest to the fact that that hasn't worked out so well. In fact, most of the nuclear powers today have used the fact that they were just interested in a nuclear power program to get themselves a nuclear weapons program. Tom has properly said there has to be an emphasis on verification. This treaty would be utterly unverifiable. There is no way that you can have on-site, intrusive inspections everywhere all the time. I mean, it's easy to say that. You could even say it in a treaty. But it will not happen. Max Kampelman, with whom I had the privilege of serving, remembers, I'm sure, the exhaustive negotiations in various treaties, including the Chemical Weapons Convention, as well as these strategic arms treaties, which it's just not practical. You cannot actually get into the heart, for example, of Russia without an awful lot of cooperation from the Russians. Think about it. If you're dealing with closed societies, and Tom represented us in at least one, perhaps several, it's child's play to conceal things from inspectors who cannot, in fact, have omniscience. And there will be an extraordinary premium on cheating. He said, in the land of the blind, the one-eyed man is king. Absolutely. In the land of no nuclear weapons, the guys that have a few are king and are likely to be aggressors as well. So let me come to the concluding point, which is there really any harm in trying? And I think this is sort of Tom's basic bottom line and that of the other advocates for Global Zero. All right, so maybe even if they concede some of the concerns that I'm expressing, that'll be sorted out in due course. This isn't going to happen right away, maybe not even in the president's lifetime, but we'll get around to fixing all of these problems in a world in which political tensions are reduced. Maybe. I suggest to you common sense says no, but maybe. But here's the problem. I think what happens when you try to pursue this will of the wisp is you delegitimate nuclear weapons in countries like ours, which as a practical matter has a very corrosive effect on the stipulated proposition that we will have a safe, reliable, and effective nuclear deterrent for the next 40 years or so, minimum. How so? Well, the president has already made it very clear, for example, as an advocate for this Global Zero business, that we are not going to do things that will undermine the pursuit of this treaty. We're not only going to do the New START treaty that will make cuts that hopefully will advance this goal in his view, but we're not going to do either of the three things that I think are absolutely critical to having, for the foreseeable future, an effective, safe, and reliable nuclear deterrent. One, modernization. Oh, I know. Bob Gates in the Wall Street Journal today says they're going to throw $80 billion at modernizing the nuclear infrastructure. I'm talking about new nuclear weapons. The president has foreclosed that completely. And when you say we are trying to get rid of nuclear weapons and we are devaluing them, I think you will find that's the kind of thing people probably think is a sensible thing to do, even if it means your nuclear arsenal is entirely dependent upon weapons that, well, Ronald Reagan introduced in many cases. In still others, they were introduced 20 or 30 years before that. Do you know that we have some nuclear weapons in our arsenal today that actually have vacuum tubes in them? Do you want to rely on those nuclear weapons for the next 40 years as a critical part of a deterrent that we, I think, agree needs to be maintained in a safe and credible and reliable way? I doubt it. Secondly, there will be no testing of those obsolescent weapons. This is pursuant to a unilateral commitment to a treaty that was actually rejected by the United States Senate by a majority vote. The president wants to bring it back up. The Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty was explicitly designed to reduce the reliability of nuclear forces. So that's what we're relying on, is less reliable nuclear weapons for the foreseeable future while we are waiting this halcyon program to arrive. And then finally, and this is really troubling, Bob Gates, as I said in the Wall Street Journal today, talks about the commitment to the nuclear infrastructure. Well, what's at the core of the nuclear infrastructure? The people. Do you know that you can probably count on one hand the number of people in our nuclear weapons complex today who have had any direct experience designing, producing, or testing a nuclear weapon? And they're old. Do you want to rely on kids who have had no experience with that at all, and their sophisticated computers?
maybe, but do you want to make sure that they think that their job is important? Do you want the best and brightest of those kids to be doing that? Then I suggest to you that you do not tell them that you devalue them and their mission, which is another part of this whole program, to show the world that we are moving in the direction of global zero. We are devaluing nuclear weapons. Let me conclude by simply saying, if you're worried about proliferation, I submit to you the last thing you want to do is encourage the bad guys on the planet, and there are plenty of them, to think you're going out of the nuclear weapons business, and indeed we are. Or that we're going way down in the nuclear weapons numbers count so that they can build up and become a peer competitor. Or worse, that our allies who have counted upon our extended nuclear deterrent, and still do, especially when they're threatened now by the Russians. Not in some ancient history, but now by the Russians. Well, they may just conclude they have to have nuclear deterrence of their own, since ours are becoming unreliable and unsafe and unsustainable. And in any event, we're determined to go out of the business. That is a formula, ladies and gentlemen, for not only more nuclear weapon states, more possibilities that these nuclear weapons will fall into the wrong hands, but I think probably the use of nuclear weapons. In short, a much more dangerous world, even from trying to bring about one without nuclear weapons. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Frank. Tom?
Thank you very much, David. Let me try to pick up on a number of the points that Frank made, some of which I think tend to prove my argument, some of which I think are based on constructions that are tortured at best and certainly not generally supported by the modicum of people who work on these programs. But let me begin with the notion, perverse as I think it is, that we are mistaken and indeed highly, treading on highly dangerous ground to even advocate a look at this serious possibility. Nothing I've heard from Frank leads me to believe that that has any basis in reality, but let me take them one at a time. The notion that we can build down so they can build up entirely misses the point that nowhere has anybody who looks at this ever advocated unilateral disarmament. That, of course, is the principal definition of unilateral disarmament, and I don't think it is either wise or saleable or indeed part of the proposal to move it ahead. The notion that our stockpile is turning to green cheese before our eyes because we aren't daily testing nuclear weapons is belied by the fact that all the lab directors, all the military leaders, everyone involved in the program is highly confident and goes to the Congress on a regular basis, and the Congress is no slouch in examining them, that indeed they believe that our stockpile maintains the capability that we vest in it, is up to date, and can be moved ahead. Rather than limiting, in fact, the arrangements for modernizing nuclear weapons, if you read carefully, the President has actually opened the possibility that previously tested nuclear components that are in our stockpile but never incorporated in weapons can be used to modernize our weapons under the current set of definitions, which seems to me to be wise and sensible, and indeed gets at some of the problems that Frank would have us worry about and lose sleep over. I think it is important as well that we continue to assure ourselves that any effort that we undertake in this direction has to involve others to move ahead. The fact that verification systems are snares and delusions, I think, is entirely mistaken. In fact, the verification system applied in Iraq was a great deal righter than, more correct than our national conclusions about what Iraq actually had. Something that, had we paid attention to it, I think we might have actually benefited enormously and not be bogged down in Iraq today with all the losses that we had. No one is suggesting, Frank, that we do a Kellogg-Briand on this deal, that we suddenly arrive at a one-line treaty that says basically all nuclear weapons are ruled out, and expect, in fact, it to be self-enforcing, self-implementing, self-operating, and a self-nirvana.
You and I think, would be entirely on the same side of the ledger with respect to that. What we're proposing, despite your deep concerns that this is somehow delegitimatizing nuclear weapons, I think quite to the contrary. It's taking a look at a sane and sensible policy for dealing nuclear weapons for the long-term future. But what we're proposing is an international cooperative effort to get there. If that can't work and won't work, then obviously this is not a process that anyone that I know of with still this side of the loony bin would recommend to the American president, the American Congress, and the American public to move the particular question ahead. I think it's achievable, but others will disagree. But I think what is, in my view, totally impermissible is the notion that, on the basis of the arguments you've advanced, that we should not actually take a careful look, study this possibility, see in fact whether it can work on its own terms or not, and test whether in fact we can, at the end of the day, have a more stable, a more sensible, and I think more effective regime. I do not propose total and complete disarmament as the only predicate for moving in this direction. I'd love to see it happen. I don't think it will. I think zero nuclear weapons is hard enough. But I do think, and as I said in my opening remarks, we have to have at least some arrangement with respect to conventional forces, so that indeed disparities and indeed outsized activities do not become the kind of danger you foresee, which you only believe can be corrected by nuclear weapons threats or being able, God forbid, to use nuclear weapons to correct those questions. I think that that's a self-correction into disaster. In any event, I'm happy to have heard your arguments. I think that we could discuss any of them further. I think I probably have used up my 5 minutes, but I thank you for the chance to come back and rebuttal.
Thank you, Tom. Frank, you have the last word.
Well, I think unless we're going to miss the Q&A,
No.
there will be some other last words here, but I look forward to perhaps getting into some of these things in greater detail with that. I'm not a nuclear physicist, and my recollection of your resume is you are not either, nor is Max, to my knowledge. This is a bit of a priesthood. And I would be very careful about imputing to those who are currently lab directors a level of enthusiasm about this arrangement that I don't believe they exhibit. Are they continuing to certify our nuclear stockpile? Yes, the lab directors are continuing to certify that. Are they increasingly trying to say they've got growing concerns about its condition? Unmistakably. I don't believe the Congress is providing the kind of oversight on this that they should have, in part because we've had in one critical subcommittee, the Energy and Water Resources Subcommittee of the House Appropriations Committee, people who have actually been, I believe, exceedingly irresponsible with respect to oversight of our nuclear weapons complex and importantly, maintaining its effectiveness, both the physical plant and the people. Now, as to the weapons themselves, again, as a non-physicist layperson, let me simply suggest to you, is there anything in your lives that is 40 years old that has not been tested in a realistic way since 1992 that you would bet your life on, or your country's life? Now, maybe you would. But I frankly find it troubling, since I think this is an important insurance policy. And just with respect to Tom's sort of suggestion that somehow I'm overstating it when I suggest that what's at risk here is the delegitimization of our nuclear deterrent. I'm not making this up. That's the president's position, is that we are supposed to devalue nuclear weapons in favor of a world in which they're not going to be around anymore. Now, if Tom's bottom line really is that we should look hard at this, I have no objection to that. I think we've looked hard at it a couple of times, frankly. When I served in the Reagan administration, we looked hard particularly at what we're doing right now. It was called
a nuclear freeze. It was a unilateral nuclear freeze because there was no chance on God's green earth that the Soviet Union at the time was going to engage in it, or for that matter, the Chinese or anybody else. But we had people in this country who were insistent that we had to adopt a unilateral nuclear freeze right away to set, again, the example, to show that we were moving the world in the right direction. I had the privilege of being responsible for nuclear weapons policy in the Reagan Defense Department at the time when he categorically rejected that idea. And rightly so. Because then, as now, it was a formula for grave new dangers to our country and to other freedom-loving people who depended upon us to help protect them. And that's my real beef here. As I said at the very outset, we're not just talking about
You take mine.
we're not just looking at this idea. In fact, I'm suggesting to you we're not even seriously debating this idea. That part, I hope, from what is now the beginning of a rigorous effort here. We are implementing this policy unilaterally because the President of the United States asserts and insists that we are committed as a nation to doing it. And that's a whole different thing, Tom. And that being the case, I think these questions, the questions I'm propounding as commonsensical, demand answers before we go further down this road, including with the risk of delegitimating nuclear deterrents that are still critical, that are obsolescing in this country as a result of a unilateral nuclear freeze. Thank you.
Thank you, Frank. Let me turn to the audience for a question. Let me just begin the question and answer part of this by asking you, Tom, what is your response to the argument that Frank made that
Here, take this one. This whole thing is stacked against you.
Do you think that's an accident, comrade?
the question is, are we encouraging, are we making the world safe for conventional warfare if we were to succeed in this effort?
I can't, in my own mind, believe if what I had to say has been listened to, David, that we clearly have to address both political difficulties and conventional forces as we go down, that we are indeed making the world safe for conventional warfare. I also think that it's extremely important, as we look at the arguments that have been put on the table, to do a couple of things. One, don't conflate unilateralism with the question of what I had put on the table at all. Secondly, be extremely careful of the notion that somehow the thought is so dangerous that we should, in fact, pull the brain shades down and never think about this possibility. That, in my view, is an argument born in perversity and leads us to very difficult circumstances if indeed we're prepared to entertain it. It means, in fact, that we should not think the broadest possible thoughts about our own defense and security and indeed open the door. Not everything we think about has to be implemented, and not everything we think about is necessarily going to have this massive perverse influence on the American public, which is, after all, a public that does have some capacity for thought, I'm happy to say, and is able to examine these questions on its own.
May I just respond to that? You don't have a mic at the moment, you don't have much choice. Look, I hope my last point was refuting the idea that I'm not prepared to think about this. Let's think about it. Let's debate it. Let's seriously, rigorously wring out all of the propositions that Tom is talking about. I'm all in favor of that. I think the merits of the case will ultimately come down on my side, and for that reason, I'm all the happier to think about it and debate it. What I'm not happy about is the idea that without thinking about it, beyond this kind of platitudinous, hortatory hope, for how it'll all work out, that we're implementing it. And again, is there anybody in this room who doesn't think that the president is serious when he says the policy of the United States is to rid the world of nuclear weapons? That's not thinking about it. That's saying that's what we're doing. And I want to join Tom in giving great credit to our friend Max Kampelman. I think he has helped make that the policy of the United States government. But you can't say hats off to good old Max without saying it's the policy of the United States government, not something we're thinking about. And this is the rub. If I'm right, let's ring this out too. Maybe I am wrong. If the public is induced to believe that nuclear weapons actually are something we should get rid of and that we can safely get rid of, and therefore is induced to believe that we shouldn't do anything in any of those three areas that I talked about. We shouldn't modernize the force, we shouldn't test the force, and we shouldn't value the people who are responsible for trying to make this thing go over a sustained period of time. Then I think it's not only common sense, I think it's irrefutable science that you will have an obsolete deterrent that is not safe and that is not sustainable. Now, is that going to happen tomorrow? Probably not. I hope not. Could you have problems with an entire category of nuclear weapons tomorrow? You could. Will you know that you have them if you can't test them? Will you know that the fixes that you might come up with, if you can identify the problem, fix the problem? And just a final word on this proposition that we shouldn't worry about any of this lack of new nuclear weapons, because the president has made, in a grand gesture, an exception that we can take components of weapons that we tested a long time ago, I mean, at least 18 years ago. Think about the state of the art, the difference between now and then. 18 years ago, we tested them, and we think they worked then. And we think if we plug and play them into another weapon for which they were not designed, they'll still work. Well, again, I'm not a nuclear physicist, and I certainly do not work in one of the nation's national laboratories, but it used to be the absolute firm and, I think, correct position of the Reagan administration, going all the way up to the President of the United States, that we're not going to take those kinds of risks with our nuclear deterrent. That's why he was in favor of nuclear testing. That was why he made the largest commitment to the modernization of our arsenal of any president in our history. And that is why he absolutely categorically refused to contemplate a unilateral nuclear freeze.
Let me ask you a question, Frank. What, in your view, is the efficacy of nuclear weapons in relation to the most serious threat I think we all acknowledge we face, which is from non-state actors whose conduct, by and large, is considered non-deterrable?
Well, there's the issue of state actors whose conduct may not be deterrable either. No, I just want to make the point that Iran may not be deterrable either. So the idea that they're going to get into this nuclear weapons business is very troubling. Look, I don't know. I personally, in the practice of nuclear weapons policy that I've engaged in for 35 years, I have never thought that this thing could be calibrated with the kind of precision that the question, in a sense, suggests. I believe nuclear deterrence is an insurance policy. And like most insurance policies, you hope you never have to exercise it, and you hope it'll be sufficient if you do have to exercise it. My fear is that in the interest of pursuing an agenda, we're using the justification that these weapons may or may not be that useful against nuclear terrorists who are somehow able to get their hands on these weapons and willing to use them against us, to justify getting rid of an insurance policy that I believe has continuing utility against a bunch of other folks, and may even have some utility against these guys. But that is an arguable point. I just think that it doesn't justify what we're doing as state policy in terms of getting rid of nuclear weapons on the grounds that people who may or may not get their hands on these things may or may not be deterrable.
May I just make a remark on that very useful question? I think it's important to note two things. One, that deterrence works only if the other side has to be deterred. So that question is extremely important. In a situation in which we no longer have a deterrent, the other side no longer has weapons to be deterred against. And that, in my view, is the value of this whole question. Secondly, with respect to non-state actors, the real point is that eliminating weapons and material, because material is hard to get, at least so far. The science of material is still fairly significant installations and fairly complex requirements. And indeed, the truth is that up until now, but I think for a long time in the future, we have seen everyone who has developed a nuclear weapon before they've actually had the weapon. We've known about it through happily good intelligence. So that the elimination of easier access to finished weapons, God forbid, or to nuclear material is a help in dealing with the terrorist question at the front end. And in my view, that's something that has to be looked at. Finally, with respect to playing fast and loose with our stockpile, I'm not a nuclear physicist, but there are nuclear physicists in charge of these programs. They have no less commitment to this country than either Frank or I, probably as much or more. They are not going to tell us that our stockpile is safe and functions, and to do so on the basis of written certification to the Congress, on the basis that this is some political expedient test that they have to perform to keep their job. They are going to do this only on the basis that they have helped to design, carry out, implement, and review a stockpile maintenance policy which meets all of the requirements of the United States. And I don't believe that we could expect malfeasance, jiggery pokery, or anything else in that particular set of individuals. And so this notion that we aren't daily testing the kind of weapons we have is, in my view, the same old arguments that were deployed against testing in the past. And in my view, they hold no water. For 18 years, we in fact have had a regime with respect to the validity and the strength of our stockpile. Finally, I don't think we should confuse the question of the effectiveness of our nuclear weapons with the allegations about delegitimizing. I think that in effect, the president has adopted a policy. He hasn't said it's going to be implementable tomorrow, and indeed himself has raised some cautions about getting there in a way that I think is rational and reasonable. There would some who would like to move faster and some who believe we shouldn't move at all. But the president has said, in fact, that he thinks this is a viable and significant option. And since we don't have an answer to all the questions, I think we have to obviously devote time and attention to getting there. And I think Frank has come a little bit in the direction, if I could put it that way. We're closer together than when we began on the issue of whether we should be looking at these particular questions with the degree of intensity and with the degree of the protection of our national interests that I think we both sit here entirely confident that we share.
Thank you, Tom. Now let me turn to the audience. Max? Do we have a speaker?
Oh, yes, you do. There's one right here, Max.
I did not come here to talk. I came here to listen. But my name has been mentioned so often that I thought it was essential that I stand up and briefly assert my position. I do want to say that both Tom and my conservative friend here go back many years. We've been friends, we've talked, we've debated, but my position, since it's come up, ought to be asserted by me. So I will now assert my position so that it's understood. Frank mentioned President Reagan. Let me say to you that my commitment to zero was born as a result of my conversations and the fact that I was working with Ronald Reagan. He was committed to zero. I was president in Reykjavik, Iceland, when he and Gorbachev talked about zero and worked hard, both of them, in an effort to come up with zero. I don't want to go into further detail on that particular exchange, other than to say that having worked with Reagan, I found him committed to zero frequently, and I think I can accommodate my own views to the fact that he asserted his commitment himself to zero. Now, with respect to what my position is, it's not complicated. It's a very simple position. One, I do not want the United States to do anything unilaterally in this area. While there is the danger of nuclear weapons, I'm in favor of the United States having nuclear weapons. I prefer a world in which no country uses or has nuclear weapons. And that's the goal to which I have committed myself as an international goal, not a unilateral goal. Now, finally, in connection with the steps to be taken, obviously, as a political scientist, it's more interesting for me to not only set forth a goal, but also to address the question of how do you reach that goal. And it would be irresponsible for me not to have given thought to a way I think we should reach that goal, particularly since, as far as I am concerned, it could only work if it is universal. If it is not universal, I'm not in favor of my country doing it, and no other country would be willing to do it. Indeed, other countries will then want themselves to develop the nuclear weapons, and we're finding signs of that. So that what I have been urging our public and our governments is universal with respect to the elimination of all nuclear weapons. How to do that, in my opinion, my recommendation has been and continues to be, I would like to see the United States, my government, working hopefully with the Russians, and my conversations with Mr. Gorbachev and other Russian leaders lead me to believe that they would be willing to join us in the following step, namely, introduce a resolution at the General Assembly of the United Nations. The resolution saying that to possess and to use nuclear weapons is an international crime against the very reason we created the United Nations in the first place. And I would refer, and I want to remind some of you here, that when the United Nations came to New York and was created, at the opening session of the United Nations General Assembly, President Harry Truman ended his talk by saying to the delegates, I urge, he said, that one of the first things you do is eliminate all nuclear weapons from the world. This was many years ago, and what I'm suggesting is that we revive that aspiration. And unless and until it becomes an international movement, I am not in favor of the United States reducing our strength in that area or in any other area. Thank you.
May I just quickly respond? This proves the old adage, no good deed goes unpunished. I had no idea in paying homage to you, sir, that I was adding a sparring partner, but now that I have, let me just say, I think you've just made my case, Max. A resolution at the United Nations declaring the possession of nuclear weapons an international crime against the United Nations itself. I can hardly imagine a more clear-cut case of delegitimating nuclear weapons, and I just, again, appeal to your common sense. Do you think that that will have comparable implications for both the free world and the non-free world? And I suggest you it will not.
All right, let me invite the rest of you to participate. Would you just state your name and affiliation, please, when I call on you? Yes, sir.
Thank you. I'm Chad O'Carroll from the Centre for Arms Control and Non-Proliferation. This is a question for Frank. You are stressing the importance of nuclear testing. I would point out that Israel has never tested a nuclear weapon. Do you think that's what gave confidence to Egypt and Syria to attack in 73 and for Saddam Hussein to launch Scuds in 91? Because Israel hadn't tested, therefore they couldn't have confidence in their nuclear arsenal.
Well, best I can tell, the Israelis have not declared they have a nuclear arsenal. So that could be one reason why they haven't tested it. Another reason is that they may have tested it with the South Africans off the coast of Africa. But, you know, to be honest with you, I'm not making an argument that anybody else needs to test nuclear weapons. If they choose not to, it's okay with me. If they choose to, it's up to them. I think there's evidence that the Russians are continuing to take advantage of testing definitional problems with the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty. I suspect the Chinese are doing so as well. People who understand how you can use cavities to diminish the signature of a nuclear detonation, particularly at low yields, I suspect are continuing to test. We have not since 1992. And I'm simply saying to my fellow non-physicist, yes, indeed. I mean, I've already acknowledged that our lab directors and nuclear scientists are doing the best they can. But I was intimately involved in the effort to make the case against a ban on nuclear testing during the Ronald Reagan administration, and I'm stipulating, Ronald Reagan did not like nuclear weapons. I'm just saying to you, he had no interest any more than Max or Tom suggest they do in having us go out of the nuclear weapons business unilaterally, and rightly so. And he objected to treaties and international agreements and moratoria and freezes that would have the effect of unilaterally denying us the capacity to have confidence in our weapons, to modernize them, to ensure that they were appropriate. And here's the final point. I think that these lab directors would be the first to tell you if they were asked the question directly, and I imagine they will be, should the CTBT be brought up again, that they cannot have the confidence in nuclear weapons that they would have were they able to conduct underground testing. And that's because it has always been the case when we do nuclear tests that we've been surprised. No matter how good our modeling is, how competent our scientists are. That's one of the reasons why I think you do need to continue it. Not every day, Tom. I mean, even at the height of our testing, we hardly ever did it. But I think we do need to do it more than once every 18 years, or once, you know, in perhaps never again is more to the point. So my final point is this. If we're serious about maintaining a safe and credible and effective nuclear deterrent for the foreseeable future, we're not going to do it the way we're doing it now. And that's what we really need to debate. Because it does defy common sense. It defies our personal and collective previous experience. And that's something that we have not had a debate about to date at all.
Maybe just make a remark or two. Allegations that the Russians and Chinese have been cheating have been around for years. They've never been proven. It's certainly clear that the international system detected a yield that was minuscule from the first Korean test, which occurred unexpectedly, at least without a lot of significant warning. I was around at the time of the Vila event. My best recollection is a very distinguished panel of American scientists looked at it and decided it wasn't a test. I don't know whether that's been re-examined officially or not, and Frank has new information, but the latest and best information I had, it was. I was ambassador to Israel. I know something about motivations in the Middle East. I was also ambassador in Jordan. My sense is that both Egypt and Syria, at the time they pushed across the canal
and then reposted, or at least tried to repost, the Israelis on the Golan, both understood that an Israeli nuclear response to even limited activities, however large they were, was not in the cards. It is clear that at one point, certainly there was consideration, from what I understand, on the Israeli side. Happily, our own resupply and support of Israel cut that short. But it indicates to me the problem not of the absence of testing leading to confidence about deterrence. It leads me to believe, on the other hand, that nuclear weapons and the potential for miscalculation is still a serious problem we have to take into account, which makes the overall proposition that I advanced, in my view, somewhat more significant.
Thank you, Tom. In the back, all the way in the back.
Thank you. Hello, gentlemen. Tad Daly is my name. I'm with the NGO International Physicians Preventing Nuclear War. We won the 1985 Nobel Peace Prize. This year we've been saying that that was awarded, like President Obama's, for our nuclear disarmament aspirations. I'm on the same side of this issue as Ambassador Pickering, and I say that because I want to ask a challenging question to you, Ambassador Pickering, about the verification question. You today, and I think others, have made a good case that we can imagine verifying in a post-abolition world that no one is actually trying to reconstitute a nuclear weapons capability. But it's one thing to say we can verify that. It's another thing to say we can also verify the process of dismantlement. Let me give a very particular example. Let's say a nuclear weapons convention is signed, and just to pick one of the 9 random nuclear armed states, let's say India says, we've got 77. And over the next 10 years, each one of those 77 is verifiably dismantled. And then 5 years after that, perhaps because of some political beef going on with Pakistan or China, India whips back the curtain and says, well, we fooled you. We didn't have 77. We had 87. I've never really heard a really good answer as to how we're going to verify those initial declarations and know for sure that this precise amount is what they have and not a few more hidden in the basement.
I would only say the following. The lack of absolute certainty in verification mechanisms is something we have lived with for a long period of time, so it's a risk. The ability of verification systems to be increasingly helpful is a proven fact. We know, in fact, that over time improvements and other arrangements have assisted us. What the other side doesn't know that holds back 2 or 4 or 10 or more is whether, in fact, before they pull back the veil, so to speak, they're going to be found out. So they're taking a serious risk, in fact, that we would reconstitute, and people estimate we can reconstitute within the space of a half a year, even from zero. And that, in many ways, as Frank has pointed out, the knowledge of how to do that doesn't disappear. But also the knowledge of our advanced weapons doesn't disappear. And I don't know that there is anybody around who believes, in fact, that the size, capability, extent, capacity, and efficiency of our stockpile is way ahead of others. So that to take your question and turn it into an answer to another question of why, in fact, it is a good idea not to continue testing as long as we can be sure through methods other than testing that our stockpile maintains its viability, there is another reason, and that's obviously during this period as we move towards zero to retain the kind of preponderance that we have.
Had I known you were going to ask that kind of question, I would have supported the prize. Look, this is whistling past the graveyard. To say that there will be serious risks, I mean, Ambassador Pickering has spent a lot of time in international fora. And he's actually, on the basis of that experience, said, don't think that the UN Security Council is going to be much help in this regard. So he's come up with this other scheme that, of course, has no reality to it at the moment, that some sort of majority, supermajority, is going to go be the enforcement mechanism. Tom, I can't imagine there being real risks to anybody who decides that they're going to be the one-eyed man. I mean, what are we going to do? We're going to go to war with them?
Probably not, especially if they're the only ones who have nuclear weapons at that point. So again, I'm just asking, I know you are people who are imbued with an awful lot of knowledge about the law, an international law. You have an affinity for these international organizations and so on. I'm asking you not to renounce all that. Oh, I am. Please, renounce all that. No, here, for this purpose, simply ask you to set it aside for a moment and just say, does this make common sense? But what we're really not debating is the specific provisions of a treaty that we're perhaps decades away from. We're debating whether taking the sorts of steps that we're talking about, and it is policy. It's not rumination. It's not something that the president is thinking about in connection with the various options. He says it is this policy of the United States government to rid the world of nuclear weapons. I'm not making this up. This is the nuclear posture review, the briefings that he's given, the Prague speech, on and on and on. If it is our policy, I submit to you what he is doing is having a unilateral atrophying effect on our deterrent. And that runs afoul of what even the proponents of this say they don't want us to do.
Frank's proposing us with a wonderful conundrum. It's the opposite of the Heisenberg principle. We can't possibly mention a totally desirable policy because in the end, any mention of a totally desirable policy will make it absolutely impossible.
But Tom, in fairness, in fairness.
We have to allow other people to ask questions. Yes, please.
Take it, Frank.
This is important. This is important. This is really important. You can't have it both ways. The president has a policy. Admit it. You were reveling in it when we arrived, I thought. It's not options. It's not thinking about. He may have some concerns about getting there, yes, but he's intent on driving there. And as you say yourself, Tom, the New START Treaty is intended to try to do that. Thank you.
My name is Peter Husey, and as I'm president of Geostrategic Analysis and senior defense consultant at the National Defense University. And without bragging, I think I could say I have hosted more seminars on nuclear deterrence and arms control, now numbering 1,675 over a 30-year period. And one of my first speakers was none other than Max Campbellman, who I consider one of my heroes. I also consider one of my heroes Frank Gaffney. And let me ask a question as a comment to both Tom and Frank, which I think has been missed by this debate. However good it may be to secure nuclear material in Russia and Chile and Canada, the worry I have, as David Sanger of the New York Times said 2 weeks ago, Iran will give a nuclear weapon to a terror group for the express purpose of blowing up an American city. So even if you secure China, Pakistan, Russia, Los Alamos, all our nuclear material, that is still the problem which you identified, Ambassador Pickering, at the very beginning as the real fear. Second issue is you act, Mr. Ambassador, as if maintaining a deterrent between now and when we get to zero is all agreed upon, in particular the steps to get there and maintain it. And as someone who heard from Senator Sessions this morning on this subject, and Tom D'Agostino last week, and the head of DITRA the week before, let me tell you something, there is not unanimity on this by any means. In fact, there's not even consensus as to what we should do, despite the Perry-Schlesinger Commission that laid out, I think, in graphic terms what we need to do. This administration has not endorsed most of those proposals, not just the labs, but on the delivery vehicles and the infrastructure. Third point, which is more important than anything, the city of New York indicted the Chinese government and a Chinese firm last April on 118 counts of helping Iran with ballistic missile technology and nuclear weapons technology. The day the START Treaty was signed, Russia announced the development of a new ballistic missile that goes 5,000 kilometers, surprise, just 500 kilometers less than the START Treaty limits, that will be launched off a surface ship with a nuclear weapon, with their tactical nuclear weapons, of which they have 5,000. of which we have 500. I understand, and I have talked to Dr. Kissinger, I've talked to Sam Nunn, I've talked to Bill Perry, and I've talked to Mr. Secretary Schultz. The idea was if we take enough steps in goodwill that are practical and actually implement lesser nuclear weapons, of which I think are fine, that the other countries like Brazil, Turkey, India, Pakistan, China, and Russia will help us with the outliers, North Korea and Iran. That has not happened. In fact, China and Russia, I would say, have been highly irresponsible in just the last year, as if to poke a stick in our president's eyes, who said, come join with me and do the right thing, and they've done exactly the opposite that you would expect anybody to do who has adopted the goal of going to zero nuclear weapons.
Could I just respond, since it was addressed to me? Iran doesn't have nuclear weapons as best we know. My own view is that everybody who has achieved nuclear weapons, they have two real policy problems in mind. The first is what to do with them when they get them. And the second is to make damn sure nobody else ever gets them. And I don't think that, in fact, that approach is going to change were Iran to move in that direction. I also think the Iranians have to worry, because we've already told them, that if we get hit, they're going to be likely to be a target. And that's all splendid, and it proves deterrence, but it also proves the bigger problem that I'm concerned about. And in fact, most of what you said worries me, because you're advocating that we continue to follow policies that permit the terrorists to have easier access to nuclear weapons. Now, that certainly is what your words said. Maybe that's not what you meant. But in effect, all of the things that you have raised are all related to the problems of accident, miscalculation, misuse, and unreliability coming out of the process of proliferation. And here you and I are on exactly the same side of the street. The question is there an alternative to the present posture that is arguably better, and can we get there? And Frank has said, I think, again, conflating a presidential desire to drive in that direction with everything he can, with some confusion over the fact that it is such an immutable reality that it will take place on its own, perhaps in a very dangerous way, which is really contra-realistic. You've got to take the president and where he's going on the basis of the fact that he believes that this is a very, very important goal that we should seek to try to achieve, and that's the point I came here to make.
If it were just a presidential aspiration or goal, again, we'd be back to talking about it, thinking about it, looking at it, exploring it, bringing out the pluses and minuses. I think some of the points that Peter's made are not only valid, but underscore the dangers of doing what we're doing, which is in distinction to that, contradistinction, if you will. And it is not me conflating. The president has enunciated a policy. We may not get there right away. He says we won't. He is certainly, I think, noting that it will take time, and during that time we have to have nuclear weapons. I think I stipulated all this at the beginning. I just want to say that in the interval, even as the Russians are building up their nuclear forces with new weapons, and oh, by the way, offering, have you heard about this one? The container ship concealed 4 cruise missile launcher that they're also offering for just $10 million? Well, nukes may be an option to purchase as well, but at the very least, it's a platform for nukes. Something that is designed to be stealthy, optimized for terror, for concealing the source of the attack. And so the idea that we're going to be deterring the Iranians by threatening them with weapons that may or may not be up to snuff is a very problematic business. But I just want to encourage you all, think this through. It's not about our hopes. It's not about our aspirations. It's not about what we would hopefully be demonstrating by our example will come about. It's about common sense. And if you do wring this out that way, I think you don't adopt this policy, let alone pursue it as we are now unilaterally.
This is the last question. In the back? Yes, sir.
Hello, my name is Ernesto Sanchez, and I'm an attorney here in town. This question is particularly directed at Ambassador Pickering, and it's kind of a hypothetical that I'm afraid is not that unrealistic. But would any of what you said here today change, and do you think the administration's policy should change if tomorrow we hear that Iran, or even worse, North Korea, has tested a nuclear weapon? And the reason I ask that is because perhaps North Korea, but more so than Iran, it's a regime that has, I think, in the past proven to be totally irrational and has been very hostile to, I think, many diplomatic overtures. I think especially proven by the fact that the Korean War, I guess if you want to get all official about it, never officially ended. I mean, it ended with a truce, but not an actual treaty. So, I mean, with those kinds of circumstances involved, I mean, do you think there would be a reason for an about face if either of those two countries tested something, tested a bomb?
No, your question isn't hypothetical. North Korea has tested twice. The first bordering on a fizzle, the second slightly better. It hasn't changed my mind. It's reinforced my mind that, in fact, we have to work harder to find ways to stop this. And I think the proposals that I've made are also important and effective ways to get to that objective.
On the happy conclusory note of agreeing that we ought to find better ways of stopping the North Koreans from getting, a more capable nuclear arsenal, which, by the way, they develop in partnership with the Iranians, which is contributing to the problem that Peter talked about, as well as the Chinese and Russians contributing to that problem. All I'm saying is I don't think this is a particularly effective way to deal with that problem, and I think for the reasons that I've mentioned at length, there are lots of other reasons why this is the idea of global zero is a very bad idea. But on the proposition that we ought to be stopping particularly the Iranian regime and the North Korean regime, and for that matter, other would-be nuclear threats, terrorists or otherwise, I think that we should absolutely be making a redoubled effort. I'm just hoping we'll do it in a practical and much less risky way.
Thank you very much, gentlemen. Please join me in thanking our debaters for an excellent presentation.